Hi everyone, Matiram here with another RPG Talks. Second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is second to none in the sheer amount of modules, books, box sets, and supplements that were created for it. In fact, that can be one of the more daunting tasks that a new player to the second edition can face. Other than the player's handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monstrous Manual, which are in essence necessities, where do I start? Which of these books is going to help me, and which do I need to not worry about immediately? To help my fellows getting into second edition, I have decided to start doing book reviews of particular favorites of mine, and books that I've just gotten use out of in my long career at playing this game. So I have decided to go ahead and start with one of my personal favorites, The Complete Book of Villains by Kirk Botula. This is the fifth book in the Dungeon Master's Guide Blue Splat books that were made. It was published by TSR in 1994. The ultimate aim of this book is to help one create engaging villains for their games. What this book is not is a list of NPCs and villains whole cloth that you can just drop into your game. There are several books like that for second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but the aim of this book really is to help you learn how to create villains for your own home games, and to flesh them out so that they'll be truly important and memorable. First things first, the book's introduction starts off with a very interesting point that I want to make so that you guys can understand where the book's coming from in some of its writings. It defines in the introduction what is a villain for the purposes of this book. Number one, villains are opposing forces. Obviously, you're going to want to make the villains go up against the heroes. No big surprise there. But you don't. The worry there is that you make a villain who just has no reason to oppose the party. So that's really the first thing you have to focus on. Number two, villains are powerful adversaries. This book is helping you design characters who are going to be long-term threats to the peace and tranquility of your campaign so that the party is going to have to engage them for long term. This book really isn't designed to help you make individual encounters or anything of that nature. It's really more to help you make long-term, powerful, like your big bad evil guys. Number three, villains are unsympathetic. Now, this is one that people may call out on, but the whole point they're making is that you shouldn't make the villain too soft. The idea is these guys are bad to the bone for a reason, and that's part of why the villains are opposed by the heroes. Now, this is the one point that you can kind of see the design philosophy of TSR at the time. This is 94, so we're kind of past the danger of the 80s and the, I guess, parent outrage of Dungeons and Dragons. But there was still a general rule at the time in TSR that villains really weren't supposed to look too glamorous. They were supposed to be unsympathetic. They were supposed to be evil. And there was definitely kind of, hey, you need to play the good guys in the game. And that point kind of comes through there. Following that, number four is that villains have bad motives. This book is designed to help you make the bad guys, not the good guys. And it really doesn't try to pretend to be anything else. And number five, and I think this is the most important because the whole book is kind of based off this, in that villains engage emotions. The whole idea for this book is to help you make villains that matter to your player characters. Villains that they love to hate. And you really can't do that without really fleshing out your villains and making them truly stand out from the rest of the NPCs in your world. So, just to go over the book quickly, the book is split into 10 chapters, and then there's a section of tables in behind. Chapter 1 is on defining your villain. This goes through sort of 11 questions that you need to ask when you're building your villain. What is his occupation? What are his objectives? What are his motives? Etc. But the great thing about this is as you're going through this and learning about what the parts of defining your villain are, there are little black or gray text boxes where the book is doing that alongside you with a warlord called Bakshra. And it's cool because in each section they give you some famous villains, like they mentioned Sweeney Todd, Cruella de Vil, stuff like that from literature, movies, and etc. But you also see them doing it whole cloth alongside you, so you can kind of get an idea of what is meant by defining your villain. Chapter 2 talks about henchmen, flunkies, and lackeys. Basically, those less important characters who can serve as temporary threats to the party, and how you use those to help tell the villain's story and make it make sense why the villain would be interacting with these various lesser creatures. In the same vein, Chapter 3 talks about villainous organizations, and this is more focused on how the villain spends his time, what friends and alliances the villain would have with equal or more powerful beings. The cool part of this chapter is that it helps you automatically build in your safety net. In the event that your villain is killed off early, if you've built a villainous organization with them, either a hierarchy or a network as they describe here, you have continuing threats and continuing story ideas that are built into it. And again, just like the other chapters, you're seeing this being done with Bakshra's Blood Knights, who are sort of his guys, and then he is a member of a warlord's alliance that is built in there as well. Chapter 4 is called Introducing Your Villain, and really focuses on how you set up the plot to bring your villain into contact with the party. They kind of discuss different types of plots, linear versus matrix, that sort of thing. It's probably one of the few basic chapters in the book in that it will be very much helpful to starting DMs, not quite as much to folks who have been playing a while. Chapter 5 is called Delivering the Goods, and it's all about how to roleplay your villain and how to describe events and use acting tricks, your voice inflection, posturing, stuff like that, to help bring the villain alive and make the villain stick out to the party. Chapter 6 talks about how you take monsters from the Monstrous Manual and turn them into villains. And again, keeping in mind sort of the definition of the villain is taking these monsters and making them super important to your game, and to turn them into characters that the players will love to hate. They give an example in this book with a Medusa, which is kind of cool. The Medusa is like an art collector, and goes around like with a big caravan selling her wares, and it's kind of neat. Chapter 7 is Advanced Villains. It just talks about different ways of introducing your villains to the campaign. Talks about reoccurring villains, setting the villains up as a rival, the faceless villains like Sauron from Lord of the Rings, or Professor Moriarty from the Sherlock Holmes tales. And this is one of my favorite chapters because it gives you a lot to think about, and particularly if you're new to creating and running games, this chapter is worth its weight in gold. One of my favorite parts of this chapter, actually, is the very end of it, where they go through each of the 9 alignments and give you examples of how to make villains for those alignments. After that is Chapter 8, is Creative Villainy. Just talks about how to get the most out of your villain encounters, the idea of using villains as servants for a quick turnaround, and how to make hero-created villains. How to basically use the bad decisions that players always make to help create villains for them. And there's just a lot of really good stuff in there about raising the emotional stakes. Chapter 9 is a compendium of villains. This is really the only part in the book where mechanics come in. It talks about the 5 villains that the book has been mentioning in examples through the whole thing. And it also talks about 3 organizations. My favorite of which is the Corn Kings, which is like a Children of the Corn-esque harvest cult that sacrifices people. So that's pretty cool. 10 is called a catalog for villains. Really, the only part of this chapter I like is the first part. It talks about the different sources of power for your villains and how a wizard might go about doing something differently than a priest or differently than a politician. And you see all of these different sources of power, whether it's magical or temporal power, for and how that's going to interact with the villain's motives and what they do differently. Then there's lists of sort of bad objectives, motives, and personalities that you can give your villains, kind of to spark some ideas. The book ends with a simple villain table section where it basically lets all of the stuff that you're supposed to be building into the character, the methods, the source of power, etc., on random tables. So it's one of those things that I've gotten a lot of use of as I've gotten older as a DM, when you're just like, you know what, I don't know where I want to do this campaign. Let's go ahead and roll up some fun stuff and see what happens. And it's enough in the book where with a few simple die rolls, you can come up with a villain that, with a little bit of work and imagination, can turn into a whole campaign for you. And I've done that several times. All in all, I think this book is definitely a must-read. I would rate it 5 out of 5. Mr. Bacula did an excellent job. Inside, I mean, the book is great. All the information is great. And on top of that, you really have, in terms of your artwork, some of the big hitters of the second edition world. You've got art by Larry Elmore, Graham Nolan, Bruce Eagle, Jeff Easley, Keith Parkinson. And I mean, those guys can do artwork that's so evocative, it's going to give you character ideas and villain ideas just by itself. So all in all, I would certainly recommend getting this book. It's pretty easy to find. I mean, back when it was new, when I bought it, it was $18. You can probably find it for half that on eBay. But I definitely suggest anybody who is a dungeon master or a game master of any game, because the book is very game neutral. There's not a lot of statistics in it. It's really all about how, as a DM, you build characters and villains. And I think it's a great book and one that I would highly recommend. But I wanted to thank everyone for watching this quick video. If you have any suggestions on other books that you would like me to review in the future, please leave them in the comments below. And if you agreed or disagreed with my assessment of the complete Book of Villains, certainly talk about it below. I'll be more than happy to discuss any thoughts that other folks have on it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we will catch you on the next RPG Talks. Thanks.